This is the Read, Write, and Create podcast, the podcast where you get a bite-sized session of creative writing coaching from me, Lori L. Tharps. I'm a storytelling evangelist who moved to the south of Spain so I could live a global literary life. I'm also an award-winning author of both fiction and nonfiction, a journalist, and a former college professor. I created this podcast because I want to help as many BIPOC writers as possible get their stories out of their heads and into the world. Are you ready? Let's go. Hello, storytellers, scribes, and writers of all kinds. On episode 42 of the podcast, we are running an interview we did way back in 2019 with author Laila Lalami. Laila is the author of several award-winning novels, including my favorite, The Moor's Account, and Secret Son. A native of Morocco, Laila is a professor of creative writing at the University of California Riverside. During our conversation, Laila talks about her rigorous research and writing process for all of her novels, why she had to decolonize her writing voice, immigration, and who truly belongs in America. Now, we had Laila on the show in 2019 to discuss her then brand new novel called The Other Americans. The Other Americans is both a whodunit thriller and a meditation on the changing face of America. The novel begins with the mysterious death of a Moroccan immigrant. But as we try to figure out who killed this family man and scrappy entrepreneur, we are introduced to a multicultural cast of characters from the same small town who all have some connection to the victim. I wanted to rerun this episode now in the wake of our recent presidential elections because The Other Americans is the perfect novel to read to try to understand the friction and violence between all of the different people who call America home. This book offers a nuanced examination from multiple perspectives of what happens behind closed doors when the people and complexion of the country changes. I also wanted to rerun this episode because Laila Lalami has a new book coming out in March 2025 called The Dream Hotel, and it sounds incredible. It's a total departure from all of our other work, but I think if you like good storytelling and contemporary issues, you will love The Dream Hotel. I'll leave links to learn more about that book and to purchase The Dream Hotel and The Other Americans in the show notes. In the meantime, please enjoy my conversation with Laila Lalami. Welcome to the Read, Write, and Create podcast, Laila Lalami.
Thank you for having me.
So I want to actually begin by telling all of my listeners that I am very much a huge fan of yours. So I may start to sound like a fangirl a little bit on this episode of the podcast because I just discovered you as a writer this summer and kind of binged as many of your books as I could. And I chose The Other Americans as our book club pick because it just screamed melting pot. It talks about all of the issues and things that we love to talk about in the My American Melting Pot community. So the first question I have for you is, when you have to describe what The Other Americans is about, what do you say?
Well, I usually say that it's a story that is about a family grieving the loss of their father, but on a sort of larger scale, it's a story about home. What is it and how do we find it and what it means to all of us.
Yeah. So what does home mean to you as someone who lives in the United States but was born and raised in Morocco?
Yeah, this is a question that I get a lot. I never intended to be an immigrant. It sort of happened by chance. I came to the United States in 1992 to do a graduate degree, and about a couple years later, I met someone, we fell in love, we got married, and before I knew it, I was, an immigrant. So it really happened by chance, and what that has meant for me is that an idea that I hadn't really thought about much when I was growing up, which is the idea of home, became a bit more complicated because obviously I travel between the two places. but I have lived now half my life in the United States, and I have a family here. And so I think over the years I've come to think of it not so much as a place, but as a connection to people. So home is wherever my family is, my husband and my daughter and the people who love me. And so I would say for me it's more connected to people than to place.
Yeah. The thing that makes the book, The Other Americans, so powerful, I think, is that we do hear from so many different people who are struggling with this idea of home. Like, what does home mean and who belongs where? And at the same time, these ideas and these characters in this book seem so relevant to where we are today. These questions of who belongs where, who gets to claim America as home. Was there a particular incident in real life that inspired this story?
Yeah, so about 5.5 years ago, I was on vacation with my family in Wyoming, and I got a text in the middle of the night from my sister telling me that our father had taken gravely ill. And so we sort of scrambled to try to find a flight to go to Morocco and be with him. I had been told that he was basically dying, and I wasn't even sure I was going to make it. But, thanks to the miracles of modern medicine, he recovered and he's in full health. And so we got to spend some time together and he recovered. But that sort of scare stayed with me. And when I came back to California, I realized one of the consequences of a decision that I had taken when I was in my 20s, which was the decision to stay here and to become an immigrant and later a naturalized American, has had this consequence later of separating me from my parents and giving me this feeling of constantly worrying about them because they're getting older and I can't really be there for them all the time. So I thought, it would be interesting to explore sort of these ideas in the canvas of fiction, and I wanted to put on the very first page something very scary to me, which is the death of a father, and sort of explore it from the perspective of this young woman who lives elsewhere in California and has to return to this small town in the Mojave, a town that she thought she had left behind for good, but now she has to return home. And in the process of doing that, the reader is introduced to basically other members of her family, to somebody that she went to high school with who later becomes a love interest, the detective who's investigating the case, a witness. So each of these characters take turns narrating the story of this hit and run, basically. And when they narrate the story each time, it gets recast as a different story. So you mentioned earlier that it's a story that talks about immigration, and yes, because when the mother talks about the hit and run, she sort of drifts into reminiscences of the decision to immigrate to America and how it came about for her family in 1981 out of a very specific set of circumstances. When the detective is narrating the story, it becomes a crime story, but at the same time, for the detective, that's just the case that's on the docket for her, but she also has her own concerns. She relocated to the Mojave from Washington, D.C., and she's dealing with her own feelings of dislocation within the United States. When the love interest recounts the story, then it becomes a story of war because he's a veteran of the Iraq War, and he carries with him a great deal of guilt about his experiences and the things that he witnessed when he was over there. So each time a character takes turn telling the story, it's like a new layer is revealed. And I chose to do it this way because I wanted to do something very different from my previous book, which was a historical novel. And this one gave me the opportunity to explore different points of view rather than staying with one for 400 pages. So I got to sort of play with all of these characters.
Is there one character that you identify with the most?
I feel close to all of them, to be honest with you, because each one of them gave me something to think about and to experience emotionally. Naturally, I have a bit more feeling for the young woman who begins the story because she is an artist. She's a musician, and she's struggling in her field and struggling to get her art in front of audiences. So I do feel a bit of kinship with her from that perspective. And of course, the fact that she's very close to this father and the story begins with her losing her father. I would say, yes, I do feel close to her, but it doesn't mean that I don't feel close to the other characters. In particular, the mother who narrates the story, her story anyway, who narrates her story of immigration and has sort of misgivings about this decision. That's another aspect that I enjoyed exploring, So each one sort of gave me a gift in a different way.
Yeah, I mean, I love this story so much because, first of all, I don't think I've ever read a story that was set in the Mojave Desert. And you don't get to see these particular characters in the Mojave Desert, right? I mean, you don't see a Black woman detective in the Mojave Desert, right? That's just not common. And yet everybody who, shows up in this novel has a reason for being there. So I love that. I love any story that challenges my ideas of where people belong. But I also just loved the variety of characters that you brought into this story. And I just, you said you identify with all of them in some way. And I'm just like, what's going on in your mind? Like, how did you come up with such great characters? Like, were they somewhat based on people you've known or people you've come in contact with? Or, how does a person bring to life such disparate characters in such an amazing, first-person way?
Oh, you're so nice. This came about as a result of both personal and craft reasons. So the craft reasons first. When I started working on this book, I knew I wanted the death to be on the first page to start with it so I can sort of get it out of the way. This is what the story is about. And I made it a hit and run because I thought it, would make it more interesting for me to stay with the book for 400 pages. But I realized right away that this could not be a story that's set in a big city because I wanted there to be a sense of suspense and just looming discovery of who might have done it, that it could be somebody that you've met in a previous page because it's such a small community and everybody knows everybody. And I wanted the sense in the story of a smaller canvas that way. So I knew it had to be a small town. And the other reason, too, is that I think that, we often think of the big cities as these multicultural spaces, and that is true of almost every big city in America, with a few exceptions. But even rural areas can be extremely diverse in ways that I don't think make it into popular culture. So I'm thinking, for example, of areas of the Central Valley here in California, which are farming communities. You'd be amazed at some of the diversity there. I mean, I remember driving recently, and there were signs in Punjabi. It's just incredibly diverse communities, and I wanted to play with that. So the hit and run takes place on Chemehuevi Way, which is the name of the Native American tribe that first settled that part of the Mojave. And everybody else who comes after that is in some sense, both historically and realistically in the novel, a transplant of some kind. And so the personal reason is that when I started working on the book and I wanted to write about this family grieving the loss of the father, the story sort of got bigger and it became clear to me that it was trying to say something about America and the place of immigrants in it. And for that reason, I had to expand the scope to include different experiences and to examine how they relate to this family. And in doing that, I did not base the characters on anybody that I know. So I don't know a detective. I don't know an Iraq War veteran. I don't know, a person who's working as, in the hotel and is a witness to the crime. But I have, I think, and we all do, the ability to imagine ourselves in other people's experiences. And what I did was both to observe other people and what they're going through, the people that I see every day, just to observe other human beings, to read about these experiences. So, for example, in writing from the perspective of this Black woman, which is one example that you give, I mean, I've read a lot of Black women authors to write about the Iraq War veteran. I read a lot from the veteran perspective, both in fiction and in nonfiction. So it's just basically doing the labor of actually getting to familiarize myself with these experiences and also to observe them around me. I mean, I think also when you are somebody like me who's sort of an outsider, a transplant to America, you sort of have the opportunity to observe a lot and to put yourself in the shoes of somebody else, because that's the only way that you can make sense of this new society that you've been introduced to.
Well, you do it so extremely well. And, you know, as someone who has also read the Moor's account, where you can put yourself in the mindset of a 15th century slave in the most harrowing adventure throughout Florida, I am extremely impressed with your abilities to breathe life into these characters. Flipping that, though, your main character, the man who does get killed in the hit and run, who we also get to hear his voice, which I thought was really awesome, and his daughter, they are Moroccan, as obviously you are as well. And just fun fact, when I was in high school, I was an exchange student and lived in Morocco. And
Did you
so
really?
I did. And everybody, I mean, I grew up in Wisconsin, and to go to Morocco was like a really bizarre thing, but it changed my life. I mean, I had never been out of the country, and Morocco was the first place I ever went, and I got to live with a family. So it was a really deeply immersive experience, and it was wonderful. But I know that even in 2019, a lot of people don't know anything about Morocco, right? I mean, they might have a very vague idea of what Morocco is or what it's about or who lives there. And so why did you make the main characters Moroccan, and what did you want people to know about the Moroccan experience, about your country, about your culture?
Well, I mean, I think the reason is really quite simple. I wrote about Moroccan characters because I'm Moroccan, and I think that I've wanted to put them at the center of the story for that very simple reason.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when I was growing up in the 1970s, I mean, obviously Morocco had long been independent for nearly a generation before I came along, but the disruption that the French brought when they occupied Morocco for 44 years meant that even within what was available in bookstores and in libraries and in our educational system was really dominated by the French. And so my earliest exposure to literature, so if you think about things that young readers, so things like comic books and, you know, chapter books, things like that, those were all in French when I was little. And so my earliest exposures to literature were in French. And one example that I give is the Tintin comic books, which I used to love when I was little. And when I read them, I identified with the detective, Tintin. Mm. Never once occurred to me that in those books, I wasn't Tintin. I was the natives in those books. And so when I became a writer, I think in the beginning, because I've been writing since I was a child, I think at first you sort of start to see the world in the same way as you have been shown it through those books. And it takes a long while to realize that, no, as the storyteller, you have the power to show the world as you see it. And that, for me, didn't happen until I was in my 20s when, that realization came over me. And so in writing about Moroccans, it's very much out of a conscious desire to place these experiences that I never got to have as a very young reader in the center of books. Now, of course, once I got to middle school and high school and started reading literature for adults, there was plenty for me to read. But I never really forgot that sense of erasure that I had when I was little, and not just in books, but also in television series and in the movies, and not seeing anybody in those stories that looked or sounded like anybody I knew or had any of the same concerns or looked at the world in the same way. So it's very, very important to me when I write that I write about me, really, and to make Moroccan characters the center of these stories. In this particular book, There are other experiences, but of course the book opens with the death of this Moroccan immigrant and explores it from the point of view of his family and others as well. And so they remain centered in the story.
Yeah, I felt like, again, like I have a affinity for all things Moroccan. I mean, I feel like it is I don't know, I don't want to say my second home because I haven't lived there, since I was in high school, but still, because I was there at such a pivotal time in my life, it just feels like, a special place to me. So anytime I can read about or do anything that has to do with Morocco, I do. But one of the things that struck me is like sometimes in the descriptions, I would read descriptions that, it's a story about a Moroccan immigrant. And I would always feel like I want to expand that because it's not about a Moroccan immigrant, so to speak, right? Like his story is so unique. And yet at the same time, it's such a quintessential American story.
Mm-hmm.
Man comes here, falls in love with America, like makes good on the dream, has his own very unique story. And I just also loved that everybody in this family has a unique story that's extremely relatable, though, right? It's not like you have othered the quote unquote immigrant family such that their experiences aren't like the experiences of most every other 20-something, 30-something. The girl who wants to do really well, she's a dentist, but she's struggling. The sister who wants to be an artist, but can't quite get that job right. You know what I mean? So
yeah, no, I understand what you mean. And I think that that's one of the dangers that can happen when your story or your experiences are not centered in popular culture and then you decide to write your story is the temptation to make the characters exemplars of certain ideals or to make the characters the upstanding people because so often in the culture they are presented as villains. And I think that the problem with that is that in presenting people as perfect, it means that you're buying in the essential idea of their inhumanity because that means you're in dialogue with them being villains, right? And so in writing from a different perspective like that, it is extremely important to write it at a personal level. And so while these characters are immigrants and while immigration does play a role in their lives and in the decisions that led them to be exactly where they are when this book opens, they have a million other concerns. The musician, for example, is concerned about placing some of her compositions in festivals and getting her music heard. The daughter has the pressure of living up to this immigrant dream and keeping up with her dentistry office, but she develops an addiction. The father has, this affair that's kind of happening in the background. So each of them has a very, very private concern that has nothing to do with immigration as a public issue, at least as far as we hear about it in the news.
I mean, and this book is so good. It's like, it almost felt as like juicy and delicious as like a soap opera in the sense that there was so much going on, but it was really elevated writing and it felt so important because so many of these issues you could have turned on the news and read about, this hostility between the immigrant and his white neighbor and that conflict between them. So it just, again, I felt like it was such the perfect book at the perfect time, which clearly I'm not the only one who thinks so because you were just nominated for a National Book Award. Huge congratulations on that.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
How does that feel?
Well, honestly, I was trying to reflect about that. First of all, it was a complete surprise to me. I did not expect it. And, I spent 4.5 years with these characters, and I felt such joy working on this book, even though it wasn't always easy. It certainly had a lot of ups and downs, and I, threw away a number of drafts and restarted from the beginning. I mean, it just was not an easy journey by any means, but it was one that for me as a writer involved a lot of growth because I mentioned earlier it was my first time writing from multiple first-person perspectives. And I really was trying to impose like some kind of narrative onto this chaos like that happened once I realized that the consequences of my own decision to immigrate. So anything that happens after that, the fact that the book finds a reader or that it is up for a prize feels like, the proverbial cherry on the cake. So when it comes up for the National Book Award, it was really kind of overwhelming, and I felt really grateful to the judges and and just grateful that more readers are going to discover this story because of that. So yeah, I mean, I feel a great deal of gratitude.
So again, I'm such a fan of this book, and I don't want to go deep into the details because I really want people to read the book. And again, the thrill of the book, even though I would not call this a thriller, do you consider this book a thriller by any, or a mystery even?
It is a story that starts out with a crime, but it is not a crime story.
Right, exactly.
It is a family story. It is a crime story. It is a love story.
Yes.
It all wrapped up in one.
It is. That's what I mean. I'm like, it's like and I don't mean that in a pejorative way, like that when I say a soap opera, but like soap operas for their storytelling qualities. I mean, they're so addicting because they bring all the things into play. And that's why, I don't call this a thriller. I don't call it a crime drama, but it has all of these aspects to it. But I mean, there's romance, there's just, again, it's that family. It's a family saga. There's so much to it. And I'm deviating a tiny bit, but the fact that this book is so detailed, like you said, it's first-person perspective, which even if you're not a writer, you understand how hard it is to inhabit the voice of multiple characters. But I just want to point out that English was not your first language.
No.
Can you talk a little bit? I did read an article and someone was interviewing you that you originally would write in French, but that you very consciously and intentionally stopped writing in French. Can you talk about why that was? Why did you stop writing in French and what it's like for you to write in English?
So you mentioned earlier I was born and raised in Morocco, and the official language in Morocco is Arabic, but that's kind of not quite descriptive of the lived reality of most Moroccans. Arabic is one of those languages that exists in what's technically called diglossia, meaning that there are two varieties. There's the colloquial variety, which is what you speak at home. It's how you talk to your mom, your dad, your neighbor when you go to the store. That's kind of what your everyday language. And then there is the sort of more standard or formal variety, and that would be the language that is used to deliver the news on television, to read speeches, to deliver sermons in the mosque. So all those are sort of like more formal contexts in which standard Arabic is used. So you speak colloquial at home and you start learning standard when you go to school in kindergarten, first grade, and so on. Now, because of the particular history of Morocco, French is also taught in schools. So pretty much everybody, if you have even like a grade school or middle school education, you tend to be bilingual because French is taught so early on in Morocco. So I grew up speaking colloquial Arabic in the home and both the standard Arabic and the French at school. And my parents sent me to a French school, so French was really emphasized at the school that I went to in grade school. And I think it's for this reason that later when I started writing, French was sort of the choice. I mentioned earlier how it was the language of my earliest exposure to literature. And so I wrote in it, and by no means is that an unusual thing for a Moroccan. I mean, because of the colonial history of Morocco, Moroccan literature is dual expression, meaning that some writers write in Arabic and some writers write in French. And both literatures are read in Morocco by Moroccans. So I wrote in that, and I think it wasn't until I did a degree at the University of London, a degree in linguistics. And I started learning English when I was in high school. I was 15. That was my first time taking an English class. And then when I went to college, I majored in English. And I started reading. When I was in London, I started reading the work of people like Edward Said and talking about the ways in which bodies of knowledge are created in order to sort of subjugate Native peoples. Not to get too technical about it, but basically the ways in which language plays a role in affirming colonial power. And for me, going back and reading a lot of what was written in French, it was very hard, really very hard to dissociate the colonial gaze from the content of what was being written. Who is this being written for? And, the fact that it's written in French is not a neutral choice. It's the choice that makes this story available primarily to French and French-speaking readers. So it just was, I just didn't feel very comfortable anymore with it. And so I stopped writing in French and just kind of minded my own business and finished my degree. And then I moved to the U.S. to do my graduate degree. And when I started working on my PhD dissertation, it was in English. It was in nonfiction, obviously. So I wrote, a couple of opinion pieces in the, for the newspaper. It occurred to me that, for me anyway, English being so not being a part of the Moroccan experience made it a more neutral choice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I thought, I could try my hand at writing fiction in English instead. And that's it. So I started writing fiction in English in the mid-90s, in 1996.
Do you think you sound different in English? Did your work sound different in English?
It's a difficult question for me to answer because I've lived half my life now here and I think in English. So it's hard for me to know whether I sound differently in English. It's how I sound to myself anyway, at any rate now. Mm-hmm. So it certainly is in a very odd way the language in which I have the most freedom because it is not mine. It is a language that I have made mine by choice rather than by imposition. And I think because of that, I feel greater freedom in writing in English than I would in French. And with respect to Arabic, it was a language that I read. I can read it just fine. In fact, I taught elementary Arabic when I was in graduate school to support myself. But the formal Arabic, I've never been really that eloquent and I never really attained the level of expertise in it that would allow me to produce a work of this quality in Arabic. So it just became one of those things where it was a conscious choice, but in the end it was a choice that also suited me and I've sort of made my home in it, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And it's just so fascinating to me. I mean, we live in a country, the United States, where just, speaking more than one language is just not expected. And there's just so much to unpack when you are raised with more than one language. My husband is from Spain, and so my children speak Spanish. And, I'm so jealous of them because I had to work so hard to learn Spanish. And I remember when I lived in Morocco, one of my host sisters, she gave me a Moroccan English dictionary and she's like, memorize this. I was like, I'm sorry, what? And she's like, memorize this. And she's like, you Americans are so lazy. Like, she's like, I speak 4 languages. She's like, I speak Arabic, French, English, German, and I'm learning Spanish. And I was like, so she's like, it was a small pocket dictionary, but she really did not understand why before the 3 months before I left that I should have this dictionary memorized. And whenever I faltered, she would say like, if you had memorized that dictionary like I told you, we wouldn't be having this problem right now. So it just is so fascinating to me how, language if you have more than one language in your head, and you're a writer, what language do you tell stories in, right? And does that change maybe even based on what story you want to tell or who you're talking to?
Yeah. And, this may seem a little bit odd to your listeners, but it really isn't that odd. I mean, writers do, in fact, move between languages. So I can think of people like Nabokov, who started out in Russian and ended up writing in English. Mm-hmm. Samuel Beckett, who started out in English and ended up writing in French. A number of African writers who wrote from Chinua Achebe to Ngugi. Ngugi, of course, the Kenyan writer, started out writing in English and then switched to his mother tongue, which is Kikuyu.
Kikuyu, yeah.
Yeah, so it just, people do move between languages. At least writers move between languages in the same way that people move between countries. And so it does happen. Yeah, it's something that I should probably write about this at some point.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's really fascinating because, the idea of having to decolonize your writing essentially is what you're saying by removing the yoke of, French colonialism from your language, right? From your stories. So that's just really fascinating. I never really thought about it that way. So my last question for you is another kind of writer question, but so the first book that I read of yours was The Moor's Account. I read that this summer while I was in Spain doing research on the African experience in Spain. And again, I was just so amazed by this book. I just told everybody about it. I was like telling my husband the stories and I was like, we have to go to Sevilla. We have to go retrace his steps. And then, we're going to go to Florida. I mean, this is just amazing. And the details with which you wrote this 15th century character and their life and like what life was like in, the swamps of Florida. Again, I was just amazed. And that book I know was also just really, really well received. And I was just curious because that story is so very different from the other Americans in terms of time and space. Which kind of story, and maybe this isn't a fair question, but which kind of story do you enjoy writing more? Is it the historical fiction or contemporary fiction, or does it just depend on what's in your mind at that time?
I think it just depends on what moves me. I go in the direction of the story, and I remember when I discovered the story of this enslaved Moroccan man who had been brought to Florida in 1528. That moment remains really indelible in my mind because I thought, why haven't I heard this story before? I'm so fascinated and I wanted to explore it. I just had such a hunger for that story, and that drove me for the 5 years that it took to write that book. And then with this one, it was more of like, oh my God, I'm in so much pain and I want to write about it and figure out a way to make sense of this chaos. And then that's what moved me for the time that it took to write The Other Americans. And I honestly don't know what will happen with the next one, whether it'll be an image or a story, whether it's going to be in the future, in the present, or in the past, I don't know. But I have to feel moved and engaged deeply enough for me to want to stay with the characters or with the stories for a long time. And if I have that feeling, which is, it's kind of a flash, it comes on, it's not necessarily the most conscious decision, but if I encounter that feeling again, then I want to follow it and write the story. So in short, no, I don't really know what the next one will be.
And sorry, and I said that was the last question, but I actually have one more. This is truly the final question. When you're writing, the story of the Moor's account, again, I also, God bless you, because I was like, I want more information about this man, and I just looked for more stuff. You wrote it. So thank you so much for taking that on. But I want to know if you have an agenda for your work. Like when you are putting work out there, when you are taking on these monumental tasks, these stories that take so much to actually complete, are you writing with the idea that, I want this book to have this impact? I want people to read this book so they understand that Estebanico was a real person, that he had influence, that he had impact. It wasn't just a footnote in history. What is your kind of agenda as a writer?
I mean, I think with that book, I was just trying to wrest his story from sort of the way in which it had been erased by history, and fiction presented such an opportunity for that. I think generally all of my work is concerned with this idea of erasure, whether it's in the contemporary or in the historical. It really is asking you to consider who is telling the story and what you gain from having a different perspective telling that same story.
I mean, and I think, as soon as you said that, I was like, that makes perfect sense. And that's kind of what I get from all of your work that I've read so far. So, thank you so much, Laila. This has been such a pleasure. And it's so funny because I feel like your books have come into my life exactly at the time that I needed them.
That's really wonderful to hear.
Thank you so much. And when are the National Book Awards announced? When does that happen?
I think it's November 20th. It's, around then.
Well, the best of luck. And I'm just going to say this, everybody who comes on this podcast has some kind of like super duper like success after they're on the podcast. I don't want to claim it, but it's just been happening. I mean, somebody got a movie deal after being on the podcast. Someone else got a new, like an editorial job that they've been waiting for. So I'm just saying, if you get the award, I think people are going to be just banging on my door because they're going to want to come on the show. So I hope the good luck continues.
Thank you so much.
Can you tell people how they can follow your career, if you have an online presence, social media handles?
I do. So it's LailaLalami.com. So it's just my first name, my last name.com, and all the information is there about all my books, events, etc.
And I heard that you have quite a large Twitter following. Is that?
I do. It's such a, it's my work avoidance tool. It's what I use to avoid writing. So you can find me on Twitter for opinions and whatnot.
What's your Twitter handle?
It's also my first name and last name.
So we'll have all links to those on the website. So thank you again so much.
Thanks very much, Lori.
Okay, Melting Pot community, I hope you took something away from my conversation with Laila Lalami. I know I did. I just love talking to authors and hearing about their process, what inspires them, and speaking to Laila was no exception. I'm even more impressed after talking to her about all of the research that she had to do to write The Other Americans, not to mention all the research that she's done for all of her work. She's one of these people who truly deep dives into the backstories and figures out who these people are before she commits anything to the page. I would consider her a very conscientious writer. And I was also really impressed with her ideas about language. I never thought about language as being like a colonial vestige in terms of how you write and how you express yourself. So the fact that she's writing these incredible novels in a language that's not her first language or even her second language, but her third language, that is so impressive to me. I hope that hearing Laila's story and hearing her process and hearing what she really is passionate about is going to make you want to go out and read her books. The Other Americans is fantastic, but so is the Moor's account and her other books as well. Let me know if you do decide to pick one up. Tell me about it. Tell me what you think. Share with me on the blog. If you're looking for more inspiration and information to optimize your writing life, visit the Read, Write, and Create website. That's at readwriteandcreate.com, and that's REED, writeandcreate.com. While you're there, be sure to sign up for our bi-monthly newsletter to get writing inspiration and resources right in your inbox. Links for both are in the show notes. And remember, the doors are closed right now for the Read, Write, Create Sanctuary, our private community for BIPOC women writers who take their writing seriously, but you can still add your name to the waiting list so you'll be the first to know when we start taking new applications in 2025. The link for the waiting list is also in the show notes. The Read, Write, and Create podcast is produced by me, Lori L. Tharps. Our editor is Brad Linder, and our theme music is by Wataboy. Until next time, keep writing, because the world needs more BIPOC stories by BIPOC storytellers just like you.